Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
A story on the front of The Guardian about Boris Johnson there at the bottom.
Oh, I mean, the liar just can't help himself. After £350 million a week NHS
more than the Royals,
lie.
Boris Johnson.
Oh, yeah.
Unbelievable.
Oh, well.
He gets more cross about this than the royal family.
Which is saying something.
Saying a lot.
£350 million a week for the NHS lie down the bus and so on, which was pivotal, crucial, swung the result in that referendum. He's now claiming, well, actually, it wasn't true. There's another 88 million quid. It's invented
So he's saying
nonsense.
it's an underestimate.
He's saying it's an underestimate.
It's
good.
just nonsense.
More money for the NHS.
Utterly nonsense. Boris Johnson is a stain on British politics. In the Foreign Office, they must have never had a worse Foreign Secretary than this idiot who's been sacked twice in his career for lying. And he just goes around insulting people abroad, running down Britain, destroying the country.
Clever, brilliant historian.
But
actually educated beyond his intelligence.
I do. I don't know what the figure will be in the end, but we all know when we leave the EU, can't come soon enough for me, there will be a dividend of up to £10 billion.
Not when the economy...
Some of that will be spent on the NHS. Not all of it, necessarily. But if the International Aid Minister's right, Caroline Morden, who wrote in the... it gave an interview to the Telegraph, I think, today, that they're going to cut back on international aid. Even more money for the NHS. Let's have some of that money back too.
I think it's an international obligation. The 0.7% is now in law.
Now, the shadow Brexit Secretary, Keir Starmer, has reported the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson to the UK statistics watchdog over comments he made about the UK's financial contribution to the EU.
Well, our chief political correspondent, John Craig, is in our Westminster studio. John, any chance this has got anything to do with the big red bus?
It's exactly to do with the big red bus, yes, the famous or infamous or notorious claim made by Boris Johnson and other leading Leave campaigners about £350 million a week going back to the NHS if Britain were to leave the EU. Now, what's prompted the latest row is an interview that the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson has given to The Guardian, in which he says that actually there was an error. He said there was an error on the side of the bus. We grossly underestimated the sum over which we'd be able to take back control. Now, he's now saying that, that the EU contribution was already up to £362 million a week and would rise to 410, 431 and then £438 million by 2020-21. Theoretically the last year of the transition period. Well, Boris Johnson's been in hot water over this claim before, and what's happened now, following this Guardian interview, is that Sir Keir Starmer, the shadow Brexit Secretary, has written to Sir David Norgrove. Now, he is the chair of the UK Statistics Authority, who back in September of last year, there's Sir Keir Starmer's letter to Sir David Norgrove. Back in September, Sir David criticised Boris Johnson, said the £350 million figure confuses the gross and net contributions. And he said to Mr Johnson, I'm surprised and disappointed you've chosen to repeat the figure of £350 million a week. It's a clear misuse of official statistics, said Sir David. Now, back in September, if you remember, that was about the time when Boris Johnson wrote a 4,000-word rant, tirade, call it what you like, which was seen very much as undermining Theresa May shortly before the Conservative Party conference. Well, he's up to his old tricks again, his critics will say, because he's made this provocative claim in a Guardian interview shortly before disappearing off to Vancouver for a conference on North Korea. Significantly, the Cabinet subcommittee on Brexit is expected to meet tomorrow, conveniently while Boris Johnson's out of the country. And of course, the Cabinet is due to have some big meetings on the whole question of where Theresa May and the Cabinet see Brexit going. But Boris Johnson, again, has inflamed this row over the claim made on that bus.
John, thanks very much.
Let's talk about what you were here to
speak further on, should we, gentlemen, and the fact that Boris Johnson, this 350 million quid a week that he talked about on the side of the battle bus, that money should go into the NHS instead. Should we leave the European Union? He's now said that that figure actually should be even higher. Keir Starmer not happy about that at all, and he said, you know what, I need you to explain these figures to me. How so, Chukwuemeka?
Well, I think ultimately the main arbiter of this is the Statistics Authority. And when the Foreign Secretary has been using this gross figure, he has been misleading people, because actually some would say he should be using a different figure altogether, the net figure. But of course the bigger thing here, Kay, is are we going to see the several hundred extra million going into the NHS every week as a result of us leaving the European Union? No, we are not. Instead, what we have learnt, fact, we will be paying a divorce bill of up to £39 billion. Boris Johnson didn't say anything about that kind of sum being paid if we are to leave the European Union, never mind the fact that we may also have extra payments on top of that if we want to continue to access the single market, which it seems to me former Remain people and former Leave people alike have said that they want.
OK, Peter Lilly, hundreds of millions of pounds into the NHS. We're going to see that from when?
From when we cease paying money to the European Union. Chucker, I don't know whether he's ignorant or was deliberately misleading people. The so-called divorce bill is all money we would pay if we remained in. And we're going to continue paying for a couple of years, plus some forward payments that we would always have had to make if we remain in. But once we've paid that 40 million, then we will be getting back net more than 40 billion, you're absolutely right. When we paid that 40 billion, if we agree to it, then we will get back £200 million a week net. I always prefer using the net figure. I think that's much clearer to people. And I think both sides should use the net figure. When Europhiles say Europe gives us money, they should admit they're only giving us back part of the money we give them. So really, they should be using a negative figure, not a positive figure.
Chucker, are you being ignorant?
I'm not being ignorant at all. And actually, I think Peter's got a fair point, which is that, yes, Europe gives us money, but we give them money too. But I don't know many Remain campaigners, I was one of the prominent ones during that campaign, who pretended otherwise. I also think that it is not accurate. Hang on just a minute, Peter. I also don't think it's correct only to look at it in terms of the money that you put in, because you've also got to look at the huge economic benefits that we've had from being part of the single market and the customs union, which have meant that we've got extra revenue from the exchequer. But this is a very serious point, because, you know, Peter's a respected former member of Parliament, former member of the Cabinet, conceding that they should never have been using this figure which was on the side of the bus, the £350 million extra per week, when we know from the director of the Vote Leave campaign that making that promise was absolutely instrumental to the Leave campaign winning the referendum. He said, Dominic Cummings was very clear, he's written a whole blog on this, that if they hadn't made that commitment, they hadn't used that figure, they hadn't put that big lie across the bus, he's very clear that they wouldn't have won the referendum. Now, I think that's quite a serious matter.
I don't know that any one person knows whether one factor won the referendum or not. I, throughout the referendum campaign, and I did meetings almost every day, sometimes several a day, said that I thought the net figure was better, that £200 million a week rather than £350 million a week. I didn't make a single voter who, on learning it was only going to be £200 million a week that we got back, rather than 350, said, oh, in that case, I'm not going to vote to leave. £200 million is a huge sum of money, and we will be better off by that amount when we leave. So when we cease paying any of these divorce payments, all of which we will have to pay if we remain in, and we'll go on paying £200 million a week and more forever and ever if we stay in. And that's
but
what
even
Chuka
if you
wants.
take that figure, there's no sign, Peter, that that's going to go into the NHS. In fact, the Conservative government, or Conservative ministers, I should say, to be more accurate, since 2010, have certainly not been giving the NHS the funding that they need. It's not just the figure here at stake, it's actually the promise to put this into the NHS. And there's precious little sign of that whatsoever in the budget red book, which does actually project some forecast spending on budgets going into future years, including after we've left the European Union. There's no sign that that's going to happen. Boris Johnson's never been some massive champion for extra investment in the NHS. In fact, precisely the opposite.
Well, on the contrary, the IFS does assume that the money will go into public services. It doesn't say which public services, but Chuka knows as well as me that all the political pressures, all the operational pressures, all the health pressures will be to spend that money on the NHS, and I've no doubt we'll have to spend that amount extra on the NHS. The question is, are we going to have that money, or are we going to keep giving it to the EU? Chuka wants to keep giving it to the EU, so he won't be able to give it to the NHS. Or we'll have to find it from somewhere else, because we will have to give that amount of money to the NHS. Where are you going to find that money? Where are you going to find £200 million a week, Chuka?
Well, I've been very clear, actually. I mean, if your viewers read my column in the Independent digital newspaper this week, I make the case for I make the case for a hypothecated tax specifically for the NHS. The King's Fund, the Nuffield Trust is projecting that we're going to need by 2022 to increase our investment in the NHS year on year by over £30 billion. And of course, we need to make more efficiencies. Of course, we need to have better integrated care. We need to ensure that we all live more healthily, but there's no getting away from the fact that if we want the NHS to continue doing the fantastic job it does, we're going to have to provide it with more money. And I think, your viewers will look at the record of the Conservative government, Conservative ministers over the years, not just the current one, but the one that Peter Lilly served in, and they will see that this is not a party in government that ever gives the NHS the funding that it needs, and to link that to the EU, which provides much more exchequer revenue than we pay to the European Union. Well, it's a fact. You just look at the massive... I mean, in fact, even you're a disciple of Margaret Thatcher. She even recognised the massive economic benefits that we got from being part of the single market. She was an architect of it. That has brought in far much more to the exchequer than we've ever paid out to the European Union, and that's pretty much a fact.
Pretty much nonsense. I was one of the original...
Margaret Thatcher, not me.
I was one of her ministers. She never said any such thing. But we went into the European Union in the hope that it would make us grow faster. 4 years later, we were bankrupt, not because of our membership of the European Union, but because the European Union was not the solution to our problems. The solution was the reforms that Margaret Thatcher introduced and Tony Blair continued. And it was when we took control of our own destiny that we ceased to be the slowest growing country in Europe and became the fastest growing major country in Europe. When we control more of our destiny once we've left Brexit, we'll be better off still.
When we voted to leave the European Union, we were the fastest growing economy in the G7. I think we were the best performers. We're now amongst the worst. So I don't think this argument that somehow we've had this massive economic boost just from the vote, granted you'd say, well, we haven't left yet, which is quite fair. I don't think that is borne out. And if you look at people's everyday lives, you look at the 3% inflation that we've got that's feeding into everyday items like cereal, butter, milk, all those absolute essentials for every single household watching this programme. Those things have gone up in price as a result of that vote to leave the European Union. We haven't even left yet. So I'd be careful talking up the economic benefits.
Let's end with you, Peter Lilly.
Well, the IMF said that the exchange rate needed to decline by about 15%. It has done so. That was triggered by Brexit. It would have happened anyway, and it was actually going to help transform the British economy, boost our exports, revive manufacturing, make us a much more balanced economy, and get rid of the huge deficit on our trade, which was simply unsustainable. And that's a good thing.
OK, good to talk to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us on Sky News this afternoon.
Talking about Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary has been speaking to The Guardian about one of the most high-profile and most contentious claims made by the Leave campaign during the 2016 EU referendum. Mr Johnson tells the paper that the original statement on the Vote Leave battle bus, that Britain sends £350 million a week to the EU, was wrong. The real figure is actually higher. He says the UK's weekly gross contribution would rise to £438 million by the end of the transition period after Brexit, which is expected to be in 2020. He acknowledges that the figure doesn't include the money we get back from the EU, but says we grossly underestimated the sum over which we would be able to take back control. Now, I'm sure this is grist to your mill, Anna, in some ways, returning to this figure that was on the side of the bus.
I know, I was getting so excited when you said that he'd admitted, finally, it was inaccurate.
Funnily enough, we wrote it just for that little build-up in excitement. So he actually says it would be more. Do you accept that the figure, whatever it is, and there have been arguments about net and gross figures, it's still a substantial amount of money that Britain would have control over?
No. People have been conned.
In what
I'm
way are
very
they conned?
surprised and disappointed in Boris that he's perpetuating these nonsenses. We know the figure of 350 million a week in itself was inaccurate because of the point you quite rightly make about gross and net. It doesn't take into account the money that we got back. But it's more important than even that. This is not going to be extra money that will be going to our NHS. People were conned about that, and I'm very disappointed that, given where we are, our Foreign Secretary, who holds, after all, one of the great offices of state, is not squaring up and being honest with the British public, and they deserve honesty as we leave the European Union.
Let's have a look at the figures, because you say he's not being honest about that figure, and there have been arguments about it, as we know. But actually, if you look at the Office for Budget Responsibility, it had a set of figures that it looked at, and it did say by 2021, the figures in pounds per week that the government would have control over would be £269 million. Now, that may not go to the NHS, but do you accept that the British government will have control over a sizable amount of money?
I don't know, because I haven't looked at these things, so I'm not going to say things, you know, that's where I mean, what you see is what you get with me. I'm not going to talk about things which What I do know is that this is not going to be additional funds that will go to the NHS, and that was an important part of the trick that was played upon the British people, that they believed that they would somehow get this money for their NHS, and that is not going to happen.
Why is it not going to happen? How do you know it's not going to happen? Because, let's say after transition,
well, if we do
the government says, actually, we will put a lot more extra money and we'll take some of it out of the money we have control of.
Oh, well, that's a different matter. If this government decides that put even more over and above the additional billions of pounds that we have put in, so health spending is at record levels in our country.
But if they use some of that money that we would have control over...
Can I just finish my point? It's really important, this, Jo, because one of the things that people have, as I'm sure they are understanding, the reality of Brexit is that if we don't get a great deal, and I gravely fear that we will not get the sort of deal that we are being told that we are going to get, and in that event, our economy is going to suffer. And we know that we only get great public services when we have a great economy. So one of the strengths of a Conservative government is that we improve our economy. That means we've got more money to spend on public services. Brexit is going to hit us hard.
Right.
So it's really important that we don't give people false hopes and phony promises, as Leave did in order to win the referendum.
And that was during the campaign.
And Boris is still doing it.
Well, and he has revived this argument, but do you accept that there will be this pot of money that the government would have control over, and it would have the option, it may choose not to do so, but it would have the option of those contributions coming back under government control, of putting them in something like the NHS?
I do not believe it's as straightforward as that. And in any event, remember that already Brexit has cost us many billions of pounds because the government has had to put money aside in order to spend it to effectively deliver Brexit. So the reality of all of this, I believe, is dawning on people. And Boris is being irresponsible to continue to con people in this way. He should be honest about the challenges that Brexit poses to our country.
And do you think that's likely that he will stop talking about these things?
Sadly, I feel that that will not happen. I wish it would. Right. He's our Foreign Secretary. You know, this is grown up. This is proper stuff. He's got to man up to the position he holds.
We will come back to the issue of Brexit. Surprise, surprise.
Let's very quickly look at the front of the Telegraph, because I know there's a story about Boris Johnson that you want to talk about there, but we also want to talk about Donald Trump. So let's briefly talk about what Boris Johnson's been talking about this week. He's revisiting the amount of money that should go to the NHS.
Yes, that famous bus with the £350 billion squillion pounds, which, you know, was seen as very, very divisive and very controversial. Boris has decided to revisit it and double down on it and say that actually the number should be higher in terms of what should go to the NHS. And he is basically demanding that the Conservatives give the NHS £1 million a week, which would be great, but they're just not in a position to do that. And as far as I'm aware, it looks like he's just continuing to troll poor Theresa May because he knows that she's weak and he wants that top job next.
Well, yes, it's interesting, isn't it, politically, but also defending a figure that some people felt was indefensible.
Yeah, but from Boris's perspective, his entire reputation, career, future job prospects is based on being able to... He's so delivered, he's so intensely wound up with this figure now. He was the one that stood outside the bus day in, day out through the campaign. If he can't deliver that, his career and his credibility is kaput forevermore.
So he wants to be able to blame others for not delivering it.
Theresa May beautifully is now saying, I'm sorry, Boris, I'll give you this, that and everything else, even the job of Foreign Secretary, which comes with it the best office in Whitehall overlooking St James's Park. I will not give you that. So there's a tremendous clash now building between those two over this totemic figure.
OK.